Imagine entering a room full of loud voices, everyone competing for attention, trying to prove their worth. Yet one person says nothing in the corner, simply observing and calculating. And strangely enough, they are the ones who command the most respect. Why is that? Why do those who speak the least often hold the most power? In a world obsessed with self-promotion, where success seems tied to who shouts the loudest, there exists an entirely different kind of strength, one rooted in restraint, in knowing when to stay silent. Nietzsche understood this deeply. To him, actual power wasn't about noise. It was about control over others, but more importantly, over oneself. But what makes silence so powerful? And why do the most assertive individuals, leaders, visionaries, and emperors often say the least? To understand this, we must dive into Nietzsche's philosophy of power and what it reveals about strength, control, and the art of influence. He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow. Nietzsche's words echo through history, a testament to the power of purpose. But what he left unsaid is equally revealing. The purpose is not declared, it is embodied. The strongest among us do not announce their power or seek to convince others of their strength. They align with an unshakable internal force that makes words secondary, even redundant. To Nietzsche, the ability to remain silent was not passivity, it was the highest form of control. Words, after all, are a confession. To speak is to make oneself known, to lay one's thoughts bare for dissection, contradiction, and dilution. The powerful do not give away such advantages. They recognize what Machiavelli would later affirm, that a ruler is safest when unknowable. The less one speaks, the less one can be challenged, the less one can be anticipated. This is why emperors have sat upon their impassive thrones while the world moved in response to their presence alone. Silence is the currency of influence. Consider the philosopher King Marcus Aurelius, whose meditations written only for himself contained more weight than the proclamations of 1,000 demagogues. He did not speak for approval or seek to impose his will through empty declarations. His power lay in his ability to act without the need for recognition. The true sovereign, Nietzsche suggests, does not seek applause or justify his existence. He is. And yet we live in an era where speech is mistaken for power. Social media rewards the loudest voices, the most persistent self-promoters, and those who make the world noisy. Has power itself shifted, or are we witnessing a mere illusion, one that Nietzsche, were he alive today, would recognize as the triumph of slave morality? To answer this, we must step further into the philosopher's mind and uncover the psychological mechanisms that make silence a sign of strength and a tool of absolute control. Nietzsche understood that the most incredible power lies not in speech, but in the command of presence itself. The moment one speaks, one risks being understood and, therefore, opposed. But silence is something far more formidable. It forces the world to interpret, to assume, to hesitate. In this space of uncertainty, the true wielder of power operates, bending the perceptions of others without ever having to act directly. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein once remarked, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." However, Nietzsche would extend this further. Those who possess real strength choose silence, not because they cannot speak, but because they do not need to. True power is self-sustaining. It does not beg recognition or seek validation through constant assertion. The moment one craves acknowledgement, one has already forfeited authority. Consider the world's most enigmatic figures, not the conquerors, but the architects of thought and dominion. Leonardo da Vinci, whose notebooks contained ideas centuries ahead of their time, yet who spoke so little of his genius that much of it remained hidden until long after his death. Needing, or the financial titans of the modern era, such as Warren Buffett, whose strategic silence in the markets dictates the movements of economies without needing self-promotion. Their power is derived not from persuasion but from presence, the weight of what is not said. Meanwhile, the modern era has confused influence with exposure, mistaking volume for significance. Social media rewards those who speak the most and saturate the landscape with their opinions, lives, and manufactured images. However, Nietzsche foresaw that this need to be heard is a sign of weakness, a manifestation of dependence on others' perceptions. The powerful do not need to explain themselves. The moment they do, they become subject to the judgment of the people they should command. Yet even in this world of relentless visibility, silence retains its dominion. The one who withholds, who remains unfazed, who does not react, forces the world to lean in. The less one says, the more others wonder. This is not merely a philosophical abstraction, but a fundamental law of human psychology, rooted in our deepest evolutionary instincts. But why? Why does silence unnerve? Why does it command? To answer this, we must look beyond philosophy and history and into the very fabric of power itself, how it is structured, sustained, and ultimately lost. Nietzsche's conception of power was never rooted in brute force alone, but in perceptual asymmetry, the ability to see without being seen, to impose without appearing to act, and to control not through coercion, but through the silent weight of one's presence. This principle is not unique to philosophy. It is deeply embedded in human cognition, an inheritance from a past where survival depended as much on what was concealed as on what was revealed. In the natural world, deception is often more potent than confrontation. The octopus, one of the most intelligent creatures in the ocean, does not announce itself. It camouflages, observes, and waits. The snow leopard, a master of terrain, is invisible until the very moment it strikes. Neither relies on excessive movement and certainly not on noise. Their power is in their invisibility and refusal to make their presence known until necessary. The same is true for those who navigate power in human society. The great financiers of history, figures like Nathan Rothschild, built entire empires not through dramatic proclamations but through silence. They knew before others knew and understood that information, not noise, dictates who holds control. Psychologically, silence is an unfinished sentence. It invites interpretation, and in doing so it grants the silent one an extraordinary advantage. The philosopher Blaise Pascal observed that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. The mind, uncomfortable with gaps in knowledge, rushes to fill them. This is the ultimate weapon in leadership, negotiation, and influence: to say little, force others to say too much, and be still while others reveal themselves. Nietzsche understood that the crowd demands articulation because it fears ambiguity. The weak want explanations, reassurances, and transparency. But the powerful understand that actual authority lies in the unspoken, in the ability to resist the compulsion to be understood. The moment one explains, one places oneself in the listener's hands. When one speaks, one offers something that can be debated, challenged, or reduced. But the one who remains silent holds the room, controls the tempo, and dictates the space in which others must operate. But does this law of silence still apply in an era where visibility is currency and influence is measured by how much one shares rather than withholds? Have the rules of power changed, or has silence merely found a new form? To answer this, we must look at the contemporary world, where those who appear absent often wield more control than those who demand to be seen. If Nietzsche were alive today, would he still advocate for the silent mastery of power, or would he recognize that the battlefield has shifted? In a world where influence is quantified by engagement metrics, where presence is conflated with authority, does the power of silence still hold? Or has it evolved into something more sophisticated, an invisibility not of absence but of calculated restraint? In the past, power was the privilege of those who could afford discretion. Kings could rule from behind palace walls, financiers could move markets with a whisper, and philosophers could shape thought without ever stepping into the public sphere. Today, power appears to have inverted itself, visibility is rewarded, and silence is mistaken for irrelevance. The loudest voices dominate the discourse, and those who remain quiet risk obscurity. But is this shift indeed a departure from Nietzschean principles or merely an illusion? True power has never belonged to those who speak. It belongs to those who dictate the terms under which speech occurs. The most formidable figures of our time are not those who flood the world with their presence, but those who know precisely when to appear and withdraw. Consider the architects of modern influence, the elusive tech magnates whose occasional statements move entire industries, the hedge fund managers whose silence conceals their market strategies, and the political figures whose rare words are dissected more than the speeches of those who speak daily. Their silence is not weakness, it is leverage. This is the evolution of Nietzsche's idea. Silence today is no longer about retreat, but about calibrated presence. The powerful no longer remain entirely unseen, but they ensure that when they do emerge, their words carry disproportionate weight. They do not engage in the endless discourse of the masses, they shape it and set the boundaries within which it unfolds. They understand that actual influence is not about speaking constantly, but ensuring that it cannot be ignored when one does speak. And yet, there is a danger here, a modern paradox. While calculated silence remains a tool of power, enforced silence can become a tool of subjugation. If those who wield power master the art of absence, what happens to those who are denied a voice entirely? Is there a distinction between voluntary silence and imposed invisibility? To answer this, we must confront the darker implications of Nietzsche's philosophy. What happens when the logic of restraint is not used to strengthen the individual but to suppress entire groups, movements, and ideas? Nietzsche's exaltation of silence was never an endorsement of passivity. He did not advocate for retreat, nor did he see silence as an end in itself. It was always a means, a weapon of control, a form of self-mastery, a strategy for imposing one's will upon a world that demands explanation. But what happens when silence is not chosen but forced? When restraint is not an act of power, but a mechanism of suppression? In his critique of slave morality, Nietzsche warned of the dangers of a society that enshrines meekness as virtue and conditions individuals to shrink rather than assert. But he left unspoken a parallel danger that does not stem from an individual's choice to remain silent, but from a system's determination to silence them. If silence is power, enforced silence is subjugation, a denial of agency, a theft of presence. History is littered with such erasures. Entire intellectual movements have been swallowed by regimes that understood the power of silencing dissent. Thinkers, artists, revolutionaries, and those who threatened prevailing structures were not merely debated, they were removed, their works burned, their ideas buried, and their names reduced to footnotes. Nietzsche himself was not immune to this phenomenon. Distorted by those who sought to appropriate it for their ends, his philosophy was silenced not through censorship, but through deliberate misinterpretation, transformed into something he never intended. Here lies the paradox. The same logic that grants silence its power also makes it a tool of oppression. If the strong wield silence to assert control, the weak can be silenced to prevent them from gaining it. This is not a contradiction, but a duality, an unspoken war that has played out throughout history. Silence can be a shield or a prison, depending on who holds it. Yet does Nietzsche offer us a path out of this paradox? Reclaiming that control becomes the defining power struggle lies not in speech, but in the ability to dictate when and how one speaks. The task, then, is not to surrender to the noise of the modern world or to submit to imposed silence, but to master the ability to speak only when it matters most. But how does one do this? How does one reclaim the power of speech without falling into the traps of constant self-exposure or enforced irrelevance? To answer this, we must return to the essence of Nietzsche's thought, his vision of the Übermensch and the transcendence of both subjugation and recklessness. Only there will we find the final answer to silence and control. If we have followed Nietzsche this far, if we have understood his philosophy not merely as a theory but as a praxis, a method of existence, then we arrive at a final, inevitable realization. Silence, like all tools of power, is only as effective as the one who wields it. It is not inherently virtuous, nor is it inherently oppressive. It is a double-edged sword, a force that can be used for self-mastery or subjugation, for wisdom or erasure. The key is not simply to be silent or to speak endlessly, but to govern both, to master the will to silence just as one must master the will to power. The Übermensch does not remain silent out of fear, nor does he speak merely to be heard. He does not seek attention, nor does he retreat from it. He transcends both impulses, stepping beyond the dichotomy of speech and silence altogether. He speaks when he chooses, and when he does, his words carry force not because they are frequent, but because they are rare, because they are necessary. His power lies in his ability to dictate the terms of his presence. He is neither overexposed nor erased, neither a performer nor a ghost. And so we return to the question that began this journey: why do the powerful stay silent? Because silence is control. Because absence is a force in itself. Because restraint in a world addicted to noise is the ultimate mark of mastery. But the real question is not why they do it, but whether you can. Can you resist the compulsion to explain, justify, and seek validation? Can you master the discipline of speaking only when it matters? If you can, you do not need to ask what power is. You will already become it.